Welcome back to another episode of the Electric Election Road Trip and Podcast. I'm your host, Benji Becker, president and founder of the Conservation Coalition, and I'm so honored to be joined by Dan Esty, who is the man of pretty much everything, but he's at Yale right now, and I'm so excited to tell your story. Can you tell us where we're at, who you are, and a little bit about yourself?
Well, Benji, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of your tour. It's exciting to see what you're doing, and I'm thrilled to have a chance to talk together for a few minutes. So I'm a professor at Yale. I've been there for 25 years, but I like to say I've run 3 careers in parallel. So I started out my career as a young guy in Washington as a lawyer, and then spent 4 years in the Environmental Protection Agency, and that was the Father Bush EPA, H.W. Bush, under Bill Riley, and loved that time. We got a lot done. We produced the Clean Air Act of 1990. We got the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiated, incredible efforts to protect wetlands. So it was really a very productive moment from the point of view of environmental protection. And frankly, it shaped my view of the world because it was a moment of bipartisan action. So we had a Democratic Congress, a Republican president, not that they agreed all the time, but they came together on a number of big things, including, of course, that first big treaty on climate change. And Benji, not to put you on the spot, but what do you think the final vote in the United States Senate was on that treaty? And I would tell you, my students at Yale, I can tell the A students from the B students, because the B students say, well, it's so divided now, it was probably 51-49, maybe 52-48. The A students say, no, there's a filibuster, it was probably 60-40. The answer was it was 89-11 on the Clean Air Act, and the final vote on the treaty ratification of the 1992 Framework Convention, unanimous, by voice vote. They didn't even have to take the roll. So this was a moment when parties worked together. After my time in Washington at the EPA, I went to Yale. I've been teaching there ever since in both the Yale Law School and the Environment School, and really trying to find strategies to get real environmental protection done. And frankly, I thought when we finished that 1992 Framework Convention, we'd pretty much solved the climate change problem. And I could leave Washington and go raise a family in Connecticut. Of course, 20 years later, it turned out things really hadn't worked out that way. And for much of the last several decades, we've been in political breakdown. So a good bit of my work is trying to figure out how to overcome that, get people back together, and find a path forward that makes sense and can rally, from my point of view, 70% of the public, 70% of the political community. Because my own perspective is, if you don't have a really firm foundation across both parties, you can't deliver transformative change. It's too easy for the pendulum to swing and for one party to knock out the work of the prior party. So my real goal has been to find sustainable action on climate change and other environmental issues.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because for decades it has been a problem that we've had this chasm of a divide, and it hasn't been able to be bridged until recently. It started to move a little bit, and you've already been able to see action get done pretty quickly, even with a tiny bit of bipartisanship. So obviously that bipartisanship is important, but how did we get to a point where the environment became so politicized? And I mean, there's so many ways to get out of it that I'm sure you could talk about, but how did we get into it, and what are some of the ways that we can work together to get out of this divide on an issue that really shouldn't be divisive?
Well, I will trace it back to several things, but I would say there was a moment back at about the time I left government where it became a wedge issue, and where each party thought they could gin up their base by attacking the other rather than looking for common ground. There was also a significant battle in the 1992 presidential election about whether you could proceed on environmental issues, climate change in particular, and have a strong economy. And I think for a long time, the idea that it was a choice of the environment or the economy divided the parties, and frankly, was a mistake. What we know now is there's lots of ways to pursue environmental protection broadly, climate change action in particular, in ways that would be economically uplifting, create clean energy jobs. The fact that you're driving an electric car to be here tells you about the opportunities. And frankly, if we don't in the United States pursue those opportunities, we're at real risk of handing them off to other countries. Now, the Chinese are doing a lot with electric vehicles, with batteries, with wind power, with solar arrays. We need to figure out how to be competitive on that whole array of next generation clean energy technologies.
I totally agree with that. And one of the reasons that we reached out was because you look at this issue from a very pragmatic perspective. You have a history of working with both political parties. You've worked in the corporate world on sustainability efforts there. You're obviously involved in education and the science part of it. From your perspective, is there a divide on this issue partially also because of some of the alarmism that has occurred? And if so, I mean, one of the reasons we reached out was because there's this climate clock that was in New York City that was just taken down, but it said it about 7 years. It had 7 years and so many days left until we need to act on climate. A lot of people perceive that as we only have 7 years to deal with climate change and then the world's going to end, and that turns them away. Do you think that plays into this? And if so, how damaging has that been?
Well, it turns out there's actually a fair bit of social science, and you're quite right. I've had a government career, a lot of work with the corporate world, so thinking about how to bring business into the approach to climate change and environmental issues, and then of course an academic arena, experience teaching, research, writing. And I would say as the academic, I would tell you there's actually a social science literature on how you engage people and motivate them. And it turns out scaring people doesn't really help. Providing hope, a sense of opportunity, a sense of excitement about the future, that it's a future of better jobs, better lives, more opportunity, is how you pull people in. So I'm not one to try to scare people. And frankly, I think sometimes the talk about crisis and emergency is unhelpful, not helpful. And again, this is not me speaking alone. There's a broad base of good social science analysis that tells us that that's the reality.
Right. So on that point, I think that that's where there's been a huge flaw of the environmental community, is that it's been so much focused on trying to scare people into action. And when you're trying to bring people into your community and have a new community fight for change, it's really hard to get them engaged by scaring them. So, where do you think the environmental community should be using messaging differently from the social science capacity? And in addition, how can they weave the science, which can be somewhat alarming sometimes, into that message?
Well, first of all, let's be honest. There's been some extremism on both sides of this issue, and I think extremism on one side begets extremism on the other.
100%.
And I think that's sad and disappointing because it's kept us from having the conversation up the middle about how we, again, galvanize the 70% solution, as I call it. And by the way, I think there's real evidence that you do have 70% of the public that already supports clean energy. That just rises every time in the polls. So if you say to people, should we move towards a clean energy future, 70, maybe even 75% say, I'm with you, let's go. And if you say there's an opportunity to really create good jobs at good wages, and by the way, not just high engineering jobs, blue collar jobs, installer jobs, energy efficiency, lots of opportunities across that kind of work spectrum, this gets people very excited. And in my own experience as commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, we were able to get a lot done on a bipartisan basis by talking about what brings people together.
Yep.
And one of the things we did, for example, was to set up a green bank. And there was a critical move there, which was to get away from the old model of supporting clean energy with subsidies and instead use a finance structure that had used limited amounts of public funding to leverage private capital. And it meant that in Connecticut, we've been able to ramp up the deployment of energy efficiency retrofits, of solar array deployment by 7-fold with the same amount of money. And that's where you get Republicans as well as Democrats saying, I think I like that. More efficient use of money, getting much more done to move us down the track to a real clean energy future. People see the results, their neighbor suddenly has a solar array on the roof, and all of that creates a spiral of activity going up and getting us to where we really know we need to be in terms of a true action agenda.
Well, and those blue-collar jobs that you're talking about, that's such an important part of this equation. We were just in the Detroit metro area. We were at a GM manufacturing plant that looked like it was straight from the 70s, and it was it got turned into an electric vehicle plant, and we talked with some older staff members who had been there for years and some newer ones, and they were pumped about having their hand in the electric vehicle future. And these are higher paying jobs now in an arena where a few years ago was a very much a struggling place, and now they see a future for themselves.
No, it's an incredible thing, and I will tell you again, having been the commissioner in Connecticut, one of the things that was most fun to do was to go visit folks who are getting retooled to be part of the clean energy economy. So you have both young people and sometimes older folks going back, for example, to auto mechanic training to be the repair folks for the electric vehicles. Or, the folks doing heating and air conditioning who are going to be the ones to do the high-tech heat pumps and really, again, be kind of bringing 21st century technology to fields that sometimes haven't changed in many, many decades. And especially the young people said, wow, this is really fun. I'm going to not just be an HVAC technician, I'm going to be actually at the cutting edge of the clean energy future. And at every level, that energizes people.
And that's, I think, what's missing, is that there is a lot of hope and there's a lot of excitement. And in middle America, those people, oftentimes feel left out of the climate conversation or the environmental conversation, but yet there are amazing, innovative solutions that exist within those communities that are lifting people up. And those blue-collar jobs and that hopeful mentality, I think, is the way to get people engaged that haven't been prior.
So you're raising two critical points that, from my observation, I've spent my whole career studying what works and what doesn't work in trying to advance the environmental agenda. And one of the things we thought was true in the 20th century that's been proven largely untrue is that it all needs to happen top-down. One of the things we now know is there's huge opportunities for bottom-up strategies. Lots that can be done at the state level, the local level. It doesn't need to be driven all from Washington. And frankly, it doesn't all need to be driven by the government. There's great opportunities to have business take the lead. And particularly, this is point number 2, where innovation is so critical to progress, it turns out having the business community with you is a huge help. Business has got lots of innovation capacity that is hard to generate in the same way in government. And so I think if you're wide-ranging in where you look for solutions, you're open-minded about where that might come from, including people you never imagined could contribute, you can actually move the ball a lot farther and a lot faster and at a lot lower cost.
And that's what we're finding. We've been on the road for about 25 days, and we've interviewed people and met people in South Dakota and Boston and everywhere in between, and now New York City. And we're finding this kind of same thread across the entire geographical and political divide, is that you can bring people in with that mentality, it doesn't always have to be the federal government. It can be your local community. You can have your stake in the conversation. And honestly, when the federal government is as divided as it is, and there's a stalemate like there is, you need that local action.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I'm most proud about in Connecticut, where I was the commissioner, and where we brought energy and environment together to create a new Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, where we set up this green bank, where we did the first statewide energy strategy, where we improved our environmental results at lower cost, ramped up the deployment of clean energy. We did it with very broad base of bipartisan support. In fact, the core bill that put all of that in place got a unanimous vote from the state Senate. So every Republican as well as every Democrat voted yes. And what that meant was that we'd worked with both sides. We'd brought people together. We'd heard people out. And I, of course, had to sacrifice. I had some favorite pieces of my package that I had to put aside because someone said, no, I won't do that. But then I did get a lot done on a bipartisan basis. And let me tell you, when you're doing something big like we were doing, you make mistakes. But the next year and the year after, both parties came together to help me clean it up. They said, yes, we like what you're doing in general. We appreciate the direction you're going. It's not all perfect, but here we'll fix it. And in the State House of Representatives, it wasn't quite unanimous. 5 out of 151 voted no. But several of them later came to me and said, I was late at night. I didn't know what button to push. It was hard to figure out how to vote. And so they later thought maybe they should have been part of what turned out to be a very popular program with lots of action elements to it, lots of jobs. And again, not only high-end, but blue-collar jobs. And I think it brings me to a third thing I will tell you that has been missing from the strategy of recent years. And it's a focus on how to make the transition smooth. If you have jarring transitions, and that's where this climate clock comes in, if you tell people it's all got to be done in 7 years, not only does it create a sense of crisis and scare people, it creates a prospect of economic dislocation. And it makes people worried that their jobs are on the line, their livelihoods are on the line, their family's economic security might be thrown off. So I think we need to pay much more attention to the transition strategy, to smoothing the path to new careers for all the folks who might otherwise be jarred by change. And by the way, change is hard for a lot of people. So we need to pay attention to the people in the fossil fuel communities that have had a past that was based on mining coal or drilling oil. We've got to make sure we're paying attention to poor communities, people who otherwise can't afford higher costs, which they might be asked to pay. And I think we need to pay attention as well to rural communities, where the life is almost by necessity more carbon intensive. So all of this is why I think equity matters more than we appreciated, and smoothing the transition, making people comfortable with the new direction is essential.
Well, those communities are exactly who we need to unlock the answers to these problems too, because they know how to take care of their communities, they know what's going on in their communities, they know what can work and what can't work to a better degree than somebody thousands of miles away can. And that's where I think this kind of all or nothing approach that is in politics today on both sides has been really damaging to this conversation, because it's like Green New Deal or bust. And you need to start taking steps in the right direction. Like you said, the word is transition. And transition takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And it takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of stakeholders being a part of that conversation. And you have had an opportunity to work with a lot of stakeholders in your career, probably more than most people have been able to, because you've touched so many different angles of this problem. You've written a book on it, and we're going across the country with this kind of same mentality of we need climate activism, but we actually more so need climate action, and we need to start taking steps now. That's a message that we've seen from our end of things and from these communities. Can you talk a bit about your book and also the importance of climate action and how the conversation should probably shift a little bit more to the action side?
Well, the School of the Environment at Yale got a new dean a couple of years ago, and she came from the University of Wyoming. So she was very much committed to a more bipartisan strategy than Yale is sometimes perceived as having, and very much thought Yale has the capacity to convene people and bring people together. And so we launched something called the Yale Environmental Dialogue to try to bridge some of these gaps, bring people from diverse professions, diverse political standpoints, across geographical lines, and really launch a conversation, not only about climate change and how to drive action, but about the broader sustainability agenda. So we've now brought out a book that has gotten great reviews, and it's called A Better Planet, and the subtitle is 40 Big Ideas for a Sustainable Future. So I'm the editor, but there's 40 essays that talk about how to do water policy better, how to do air quality better, how to do climate change, how to think about environmental justice, how to manage public lands, how to do conservation. And I can't promise that half the essays are from Republicans, but some are. And this is the first book I've seen in a long time that really tries to bring people together and say, there's not one party that has all the answers. And frankly, one party isn't right all the time and one party isn't wrong all the time. And by finding that common ground, we've gotten a lot of enthusiasm for this project. And so I'm a big believer that this Better Planet model can be taken across the country and around the world and really get things moving.
Well, that same message is exactly what we're taking across the country right now in that model. But there are a lot of low-hanging fruit items that I'm sure you think can be done by Republicans and Democrats pretty much right now. What are some of those, and how do they play a role in your book?
Well, first of all, my own chapter is about the importance of innovation. And if you need to do things in much different, better, bigger ways, it's very unlikely that incremental change is going to get you there. So you need fresh thinking, big ideas, which is the whole story of the book. But my own essay is around how to drive innovation. And that's a function of several things, but largely incentives. And I think there is a moment of possibility coming where we could see the two parties rally on some form of carbon pricing. I think that making people pay for the harm they cause is actually a very long-standing idea, one that Republicans liked for many, many years. Democrats like as well, to the extent it could drive action. So I think there is a real opportunity to price harm causing, starting with carbon, but it's a broader principle. If you make people pay for harm, they're going to think about how not to cause the harm. And that is, again, a very old idea, at least 400 years old in Anglo-American law, going back to the old cases where British pig farmers were told they had to stop their smelly animals from stinking up the neighborhood or pay. And that's the simple rule. Either stop the harm or pay for the harm. And I think that changes behavior in fundamental ways. And we've seen that the parties can come together on creating incentives. Just in the last couple of years, there's been a push to try to drive more finance into, more investment into carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is hard to do, it's expensive, it's risky, but there is now a provision called 45Q that provides a tax credit for people that are actually holding on to carbon. And Republicans and Democrats both supported that. I think as well there's an emphasis on forests. Reforestation, afforestation, better forest management. And again, Republicans like trees, Democrats like trees. There's a big opportunity in these nature-based solutions that with the right incentives could be expanded considerably.
And I have some hope that trend, like you were saying, is not that far off. I mean, you see what's happening in Congress, and the media often doesn't report it because it's not as sensational, but there are like 15 or 16 bipartisan policies on the House and Senate floor right now focused on carbon capture, reforestation, the exact topics that you were talking about. And really, unfortunately, the only thing that's holding it back is A, there's not enough attention being drawn to it, and B, neither side really wants to give the other a win. But in general, there is a trend, and you have the House Minority Leader for the Republican Party coming out with his own climate plan. You have people like Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker and some of the governors who are Republicans that are working with Democrats. I think that we're almost at the cusp of it, but what we're trying to prove in this road trip is that we need more people pushing for that.
Well, you really hit the nail on the head. The challenge here is that it's a better media story to have two people scream at each other. And the conversation we're having, where we agree a fair bit, where we're pulling and pushing on some of the detail about how to make things really move, is not as exciting from a media point of view. But frankly, it's how good policy gets done.
Right.
It is always easy to be a screamer. In fact, that's how your base gets excited, because you're screaming and shouting and declaring a crisis. But if you want to actually drive action, the key is to find the path up the middle. How do you bring the other side towards you? And what are you going to give to make that work? And that's something I learned a long time ago, that if you want action and you want to be a solutions provider, you've got to be willing to give and take. And I don't know how it's happened, but compromise became a dirty word in recent years. And I consider it to be the essence of good politics and therefore the foundation of good policy.
I totally agree. There needs to be this give and take in society, because it's not going to be 100% one way or 0% the other way. We're going to have some sort of common ground. Otherwise, things don't get done, and the past few years prove it. So we're running out of time. I have one final question, which is, young people want to make a change on climate, and they're often in the streets. They're making their voices heard. As someone who has seen real policy change happen from both sides of the aisle, what can young people do, or maybe even do better, to encourage those swift actions through a realistic perspective?
So the number one thing that everyone should do, and young people have been less good at this than everyone else, is vote. So if you don't get out and vote, you can't complain later. And in the last election, 18 to 25-year-olds were the lowest voting demographic, and that is truly a tragedy. So I think voting and taking personal responsibility for helping to steer the political dialogue and the political outcome is critical. But the second thing I would say is combine your passion as a young person, combine your spirit of change with a willingness to give and take, with a willingness to bring in others, and recognize that the chance of actually delivering the change you want, the transformative change that you want to see, depends a lot on finding that up the middle pathway and finding a way to bring others who you may not agree with very much, but on some things you could, together with you, and find a broad-based solution that can get the base of support needed to really drive change.
Well, we see eye to eye on that. ACC and TCC are focused on building this kind of new youth movement of activists who want action, to write op-eds, to vote, to meet your member of Congress in district or in DC, to be an advocate, not just on the streets, but for action in real life, and be part of the change. And I think that's the power of our movement that I think is exactly needed. And every person we've talked to on this road trip has said some sort of thing similar to that, where it's like young people have to take this activism and turn it into action, and if they don't, they're not going to see the results they want to see.
And by the way, it means partly celebrating the ones that bring the compromise, that get the deals done, that move the action forward. Celebrate the Congressional Problem Solvers Caucus,
yes,
and not just the people that are the loudest at the polar edges of the debate.
We had a great conversation with a Democratic congressman in Minnesota who's known for his bipartisanship, and he said something that really hit home with me, which is everyone knows about the members of Congress who are divisive and they don't get anything done. No one knows about the members of Congress who aren't divisive and actually get something done, and that needs to change, because if you have a bipartisan member of Congress who has 4,000 followers on Twitter versus a super divisive member of Congress who has millions of followers on Twitter, the feedback loop has been totally screwed up.
All right, so Benji, I have a final thought for you.
All right.
I think your organization should give an annual prize for leadership up the middle, or for a spirit of compromise as a way to drive action.
I love that idea. Well, I'm going to commit to it right now, because it's such a good idea that I'm going to commit to it here at Bryant Park. I'm so thankful for you coming over to New York City from Connecticut for this, and for this amazing conversation. I think it's been one of the most fascinating ones yet, because you just have this pragmatic perspective that is very, very much needed. I wish you were in Congress, but that's a different conversation. And I really appreciate you supporting ACC and TCC over the years. I remember our first conversation. I remember where we were at when my organization and our organization was just an idea. And I'm so thankful that you stuck with it, that you're here and supporting our road trip.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and it is my belief that the key to progress is to get young people across party lines to come together, and I know that's your spirit, so I'm with you all the way on that.
Well, there you have it. We are at Bryant Park in New York City. Dan Esty, Benji Backer signing off. Really appreciate everyone tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Electric Election Road Trip.